So today's title is Table Fellowship with Abraham and Sarah. The last morning I spoke, we ended with the account of Jacob's son Joseph in Egypt when he extended table fellowship to his ignorant and sinful brothers who had come to him for relief from famine. You'll remember that they didn't know who Joseph was at that time. They came to him with virtually nothing to offer, and yet he gladly showed compassion and grace by welcoming them all to a meal. There they received the best wine Egypt had to offer, and everyone got a little tipsy from it. I closed, though, by saying that their rather jovial lunch time together shows fellowship possibly at its best. Good food, fine wine, and joy in the edifying company of a godly, compassionate, Christ-like host. Because as you appreciate, Joseph had the Spirit of Christ, as it were. Aside from anything else, that event raises the interesting question of the origin of alcoholic drink. And this turns out to be related to the origin of bread making, for alcohol was always a byproduct of fermentation in bread dough. As you will remember, Joseph had been in an Egyptian prison when two of Pharaoh's top ministers were thrown in there with him, and their ministries both had to do with bread and wine production, both of which were major industries in Egypt in those days. There is a powerful argument to suggest that bread making was not an accidental discovery by our first parents, neither the eventual result of a long period of trial and error on their part. Instead, it is at least plausible that bread was first made by God or his angels to teach this essential craft to Adam and Eve prior to their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. If this idea is correct, it is sufficient reason to suggest that alcoholic drinks go back to the earliest days soon after Adam sinned. At Genesis 3 verse 19, God said, "You shall eat bread until you return to the ground." And this is the first appearance of a Hebrew word, lechem, translated bread, and seems to be the Bible's first mention of that marvelously variable cooked composition of flour and liquid known worldwide as the staff of life. The word lechem means something made solid. And the verb form from ancient Mesopotamia means to eat or to drink. It can refer to other foodstuffs besides cooked dough. Bedouin nomads use it to refer to meat. In biblical parlance, lechem sometimes refers to other foods because it was so synonymous with a meal, but usually it refers to the product made solid from cooked dough. Archaeology shows that bread was staple food throughout the inhabited earth since very ancient times. A Syrian archaeological site near the Great Bend of the Euphrates River provides the earliest sign of cereal cultivation, of rye in particular. A site in Jordan's northeastern desert has the oldest evidence of bread making, with scraps of baked unleavened dough composed of pulverized roots of water plants such as sedges, club rushes, bulrushes or papyrus, as well as mixed cereals. Of similar antiquity are bread fragments discovered in Turkey that were made of grains mixed with ground up lentils, chickpeas and similar beans. So you might think of the earliest breads, or some of the earliest breads, a little bit like a muesli bar, for example. Anthropologists consider that prehistoric man's first major step towards civilization may have been bread making, and today that craft of bread making remains one of the world's biggest industries. Bread of any kind is derived from God's creation, of course, sometimes animal-based products, but plants normally in particular. No matter how plant-based it may be, though, bread never sprouts from the soil or grows on trees. It has always been a product of human manufacture. And this is the vital distinction between mankind's food before and after Eden. All the plant ingredients that go into bread have to be harvested, ground into flour, and then prepared and cooked by the hand of men and women. Throughout history, bread has come from man's hard toil, exactly as God said to Adam, "You shall eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your face." In later biblical history, bread appeared in every land, society, and nation. It was basic to every meal. Torn up and then divvied out to each diner, it was folded around other food to form a sandwich. It was spread with pastes and dipped into sauces, and bread was also used as a plate or spoon or to sop up liquids. Crusts could be mushed with milk and fed to babies as pabulum, or given for infants to suck and gnaw on, like the baby rusks that I remember from my infancy. When I say that this resorts back to biblical history, realize that there are many societies today for whom this is still exactly the way of it. The Bible's first explicit mention of alcohol comes after the great flood, when Noah grew a vineyard and then made wine and got drunk at Genesis 9 verse 20. At Genesis 19, Lot and his daughters fled to the mountains that overlooked the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah. Later, Lot's daughters stupefied their father by making him drink the wine they had brought with them from the city of Sodom. At Genesis 43 verse 34, Joseph's lunch with his brothers included drink that did not only quench their thirst, but as we saw, got them quite tipsy. At Leviticus 10, it is logical to infer that the sons of the high priest became drunk, which was when God slew them for offering strange fire. For straight afterward, God explicitly barred his priests from strong drink or wine while they were on duty. Now, apart from a few such restrictions in Moses' law, wine was nonetheless God-given and God-blessed in Israel's history. But Jesus understood that intoxicants also predated the great flood of Noah's day. For at Matthew 24, verses 37 through 50, the wicked disciples of Christ who eat and drink with the drunkards until the Lord's return are compared by Jesus with people who ate and drank until Noah entered the ark. Well, the oldest evidence of alcohol production is an ancient brewery discovered in a cave at Mount Carmel in Israel. And I don't mean a brewery of stainless steel and glass, but one of bricks and clay. Laboratory analysis showed that it made beer from many kinds of plants: wheat, barley, oats, legumes, and fibers such as flax. Wine was clearly the staple drink of the biblical Israelites, though, and archaeologists have estimated that ancient Israel normally produced enough wine that national consumption averaged 1 litre per person per day, which incidentally was the average consumption in the city of Florence back in its heyday. For God's people, wine was not only a staple drink in their homes or at weddings and other gatherings, it was also an important feature of many feasts and offerings prescribed in the law of Moses, and it was an essential ingredient of the twice-daily sacrifices at God's altar. Based on the observation that many features of Moses' law appear to clearly hark back to practices observed in the days of Abraham and Noah and Adam, it is plausible that alcoholic wine was an element of the vegetable offerings which Cain offered to God, offerings which would have been instituted by God in the same way that he instituted animal sacrifices. In the records of Adam and then of Noah, bread, then wine are each separately associated with sin and curse. But in the next depiction of bread and wine, which is at Genesis 14 verse 18, bread and wine appear together for the first time, both now associated with godly fellowship. On this occasion, a prince of peace and righteousness, who was a high priest of the Most High God, brought out bread and wine from a city named Salem, which significantly means peace. And this royal priest set forth a meal at which both God and man would be blessed. The king priest who initiated and hosted this fellowship meal was Melchizedek, who had come to greet the Hebrew patriarch Abram. This being the first mention of shared food and drink since Eden, the story forms a model or prototype of fellowship meals through the biblical era and on into the future age of the prophesied messianic banquet. With such God-centered diners as Melchizedek and Abram, it was obviously a reverent occasion, but equally it was an hospitable, celebratory and convivial occasion. The background to this meal was a military raid on Siddim Valley by 5 Mesopotamian kings. Siddim Valley is where the Jordan and the Dead Sea occupy today. At Genesis 14, verses 11 through 12, we learn that the raiders, the invaders, took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply, and also Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, and then departed northward. Mention of Sodom's food supply is notable because elsewhere in the Bible, the produce of that vicinity is highly renowned. At Genesis 13, verse 10, Lot saw that the land of the lower Jordan near Sodom was lush, like the land of Egypt, or like the garden of the Lord, which was probably the Tigris-Euphrates plain where Lot used to live. So in biblical parlance, the vicinity of Sodom was a highly productive land. And Sodom itself was a city not just infamous or notorious in the Bible for its gross wickedness, but it was also noted for its abundant food at Ezekiel 16 verse 49 and for its wine at Genesis 19 verse 32, which Lot and his daughters must have taken with them out of Sodom when they fled from that city before its annihilation. Well, back at Genesis 14, the military raid on Sodom by 5 Mesopotamian kings had no sooner been accomplished than we read in verses 13 through 15 that as soon as Abram heard about the invasion and knew his nephew was captured, he mustered his army to give chase. With what the Bible refers to as his trained men born in his household, and evidently his 3 Amorite allies as well, Abram ambushed the Mesopotamian invaders at northern Canaan and then defeated them and even pursued them further north into Syria. After his victory, Abram began the march back to his camp in southern Canaan. At verse 16, we read that he brought back all the goods as well as his relative Lot with his possessions and also the women and the people. So Abram was at the head of a large entourage, his 318 soldiers, his 3 allies, their fighting men as well presumably, plus many liberated captives including Lot and his whole household. Verse 16 states that Abram brought women and people back with him, even though no previous verses mentioned them among the plunder. Similarly, verse 16 does not mention Abram returning with any food plundered from Sodom and Gomorrah, but other verses do imply that some of that food must have been brought back. Abram's southward journey was along the hill country of Canaan, and at verse 17 he reached 2 sites located close together along that highway, namely Salem, the ancient fortress we know as Jerusalem, and the King's Valley, the ground outside Jerusalem mentioned in David's day at 2 Samuel 18 verse 18, which is now generally identified as the site where Kidron and Hinnom valleys plus the ancient Tyropoeon Valley all converged. This was about 200 meters southeast of the city. Abram's entourage would have congregated there around what was the only continuous year-round supply of living water, the En Rogel spring. At verse 17, we read that the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram at the valley of Shaveh, or the King's Valley. It is unclear if this king of Sodom is the one named Bera at verse 2, for verse 10 strongly implies that he had died by now, in which case the king of Sodom who met Abram must have been Bera's successor. Whoever he was, I can call him Bera for convenience sake, and note that the record of him going to meet Abram comes just before Melchizedek appears, and it picks up again straight after Abram's communion with Melchizedek at verses 18 and 21. This indicates that Bera and Abram remained in close proximity all that time that Abram was with Melchizedek. Bera and Melchizedek had clearly both come out of Salem to the King's Valley to meet Abram, but whereas Bera appears to have come out merely for what he could get, in particular all the recovered goods originally plundered from Sodom, Melchizedek, though, came with what he could give in the form of food and drink for the victorious army and the freed hostages. Now, details of Abram and Melchizedek's fellowship are kept to a minimum in verses 18 through 20, and many Bible commentators believe that the meal they shared was itself kept to a bare minimum. But the writer of Hebrews 7, whom I believe to have been the Apostle Paul, was inspired to discuss Melchizedek's contact with Abram, and that discussion helped show that their fellowship was not a small or private affair. The focus throughout Paul's discussion is allegorical or typological, whereas my focus is on the literal fact of an actual fellowship meal outside Salem upon which Paul's discussion was based. Now, in his first sentence of Hebrews 7, Paul refers twice to the tithes Abram gave. Verse 2 says he apportioned a tenth part of all. And verse 4 says that Abram gave a tenth of the choicest spoils. So in Paul's words, Abram apportioned a tenth part of all the choicest spoils. Throughout the Bible, spoils can refer to all manner of war booty, from clothes and trinkets to weapons and armor to livestock and slaves. But at verse 4, Paul uniquely chose to render Abram's spoils by a word notably different from others in the New Testament that refer to the plunder of wealth, property, household vessels or utensils, weapons, armor, or human captives. Paul's word doesn't refer to those things. In the singular literally means the top of the heap, or what we might call the cream of the crop. In the plural, it translates as first fruits, and in the classical Greco-Roman literature of Paul's day, it referred to the best agricultural produce, either from one's own fields or from fields raided during battle, produce which was traditionally offered in thanksgiving to the Greek gods. So Paul apparently understood Abram's tithe to have comprised the best of the edible produce which Abram had among his own war booty, certainly food but possibly drink as well. At least some of this produce will have been from Sodom and Gomorrah's food supply, which was taken by the invaders at Genesis 14:11, but retrieved by Abram and then carried back with him on his homeward march. By the time he reached Salem, some of that food and drink may have already been consumed along the way, but the very best remained, and that was what Abram chose to give Melchizedek. Thus Melchizedek comes out with bread and wine at Genesis 14 verse 18 to initiate a meal. Then Abram contributes to the meal when he gives a tenth of all to Melchizedek at verse 20. The final meal will have included most or all of the produce originally plundered from Sodom, including grain and casks of wine, I believe. It is on the basis of this understanding of Abram's tithe that Paul can next draw a comparison between that tithe and the tithe under the law of which we read in Hebrews 7. At Hebrews 7 verses 5 through 9, the tithe Melchizedek received from Abram is compared with tithes that the Levite priesthood was meant to receive from their brethren. Paul says at verse 5 that they who inherit the priesthood from among the sons of Levi have a commandment to take tithes from the people according to the law, that is, take those tithes from their brethren. Paul's mention of a command according to the law is a reference to Numbers chapter 18. That chapter shows that the brethren Paul mentions in Hebrews were all those Levites who were not sons of Aaron and therefore were not priests. As God explained to Aaron at Numbers 18 verses 1 to 6, he had given these Levites the vital role of serving or ministering to the priests, and he expressly referred to these Levite ministers as the priests' brethren. So in the Aaronic priestly hierarchy, you've got the Aaronic priests at the top of the pyramid, and you've got their brethren, the Levites, below that, who even though they're all part of the same tribe of Levi, they are not sons of Aaron, so they are not priests. To the people of Israel, God repeatedly gave a command. God repeatedly gave a command to tithe all the produce of the land which came from their fields. According to Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 26, as well as chapter 12, verses 17 through 18, this was done year by year, that is, each and every year. This tithe was to be eaten at the place of worship and included grain, new wine, oil, the firstborn of herd or flock, all of which could be exchanged by value for oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, or whatever the worshipper desired. The Israelite worshippers with their households were to dine upon this food and drink as they rejoiced before the Lord at his appointed venue. Besides yearly tithes, there had to be triennial tithes as well. That is a tithe every third year in addition to the normal yearly tithe. These triennial tithes in Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 through 29, and in Deuteronomy 26, were placed in the Israelites' town gates as a gift for widows, orphans, and foreigners who lived there, but also for the Levites who lived in the vicinity. This was essential for the Levite ministers because they needed the tithes for their sustenance. Without them, they could starve. And for this reason, Israel's obligation to tithe their food is directly linked to God's command to Israel at Deuteronomy 12 verse 19 and chapter 14 verse 27 to not neglect the Levites. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the Israelites eventually did, neglect the Levites, as seen in the book of Judges. Now obviously no Levite would survive for long on foods tithed only once a year, let alone once every 3 years. So coming back now to Numbers 18, we learn of God's arrangement whereby Levite ministers and priests would take tithes on a continual basis, year-round and more or less daily. These tithes came out of the numerous heave offerings referred to throughout Numbers 18, which Israelites contributed in the form of their grain offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, wave offerings, holy gifts, and their firstborn oxen, sheep, and goats. Now you may think all these laws are just very academic and very technical, but for the priests and the Levites, that was where their food came from. That's how they lived. We learn at verses 8 through 20 of Numbers 18 that these heave offerings were given by God as a portion or allocation of food and drink to the priests. Part was to be eaten only by the priests and their sons, as verse 10 says, while much of it was given by God to their whole family to consume, as verses 11 and 19 say. So that includes their wives, their daughters, etc. As Paul pointed out, the priest's portion came via their Levite brethren, which is what Numbers 18 goes on to describe. At verses 21 and 24, God says, "In return for the service they perform, I have given all the tithe of Israel for an inheritance to the sons of Levi. I have given to the Levites as their inheritance the tithe of the sons of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering to the Lord." Here, the sons of Levi are clearly the ministering brethren who serve the priests, and we learn here that the tithes of which Paul wrote were the heave offerings. From verses 25 to 32, God explains to Moses that when the Levite ministers take their tithe from the Israelites, they must in turn take a tithe out of that tithe and present it as their heave offering to the Lord, then give it to the priest as the Lord's heave offering. This illustrates what Paul said at Hebrews 7 verse 5 and shows that the tithes the priests took from their brethren were the heave offerings to which God entrusted Aaron earlier in Numbers 18. It was from the hands of their ministering Levite brethren that the Aaronic priests took their God-given food allocation in exactly the same way that it was from the hands of the Israelite tribes that the Levite ministers took their own food allocation. So the Levites get their portion of food from the rest of the Israelite tribes, and then they take a tenth of that and offer it to the priests, who of course eventually offer a tenth of that to the high priestly household. What the high priest and his sons took for themselves was not a tenth of the entire national offering given by all the tribes of Israel. As Numbers 18 verse 26 says, it was a tithe of the tithe. That is, 1/10 of 1/10. So just 1% of what the other tribes gave in total. But Paul could correctly call the priest's allocation a tithe because it was always a tithe or a tenth of the Levite minister's full allocation. The 9/10 that remained in the hands of the Levite ministers was fair and proportionate to their population size, for they outnumbered the Aaronic priests by about the same order of magnitude, about 10 to 1. As tithed portions were passed up the line from the lay Israelites to the Levite ministers, to the Aaronic priests, and then to the high priest, they reduced in quantity, of course, but they also increased in quality, until the priests, and ultimately the high priest, partook of the very best portions of all the produce of the land. As God told high priest Aaron at Numbers 18 verses 12 through 13, all the best of the fresh oil and all the best of the fresh wine and of the grain, the first fruits of those which they give to the Lord, I give them to you. The first ripe fruits of all that is in their land which they bring to the Lord shall be yours. From this, along with Paul's commentary, we learn that Abram also gave his tithe from the best of his spoils to the priest Melchizedek. Paul mentions that the priests have commandment according to the law to collect a tithe. By contrast, Abram was not under any such law. He was not commanded to give. Instead, he gave of his best by choice and by his own initiative. It had been Abraham's food, won in fair fight. I should say Abram's food. He wasn't yet known as Abraham. But it was his food, won in fair fight, and he gave it away so it could be available in the service of fellowship under the headship of God's king priest. And so all who had gathered at the King's Valley that day also shared in the king's table, thanks in part to Abram's tithe. And recall that this gathering included Lot and Bera from Sodom. As to why a king of Sodom was at Salem in the first place, this is surely because he was one of those refugees whom verse 10 says survived the attack in Siddim Valley and then fled into the hills where Salem was. He must have then sought and obtained refuge with Melchizedek in his fortress city. And thus we are presented here with a king of peace and righteousness and a priest of the Most High God who was evidently providing hospitable, safe haven to one of the citizens of Sodom, a people described in Genesis 13 verse 13 as wicked and sinners against the Lord exceedingly. Melchizedek clearly then was a man of similar character to Messiah himself, whose own mission is to invite and welcome sinners into his presence that they too may be saved. It was this Christ-like spirit that also motivated Abram to save his relative Lot, even though he too was a citizen of Sodom. And in that same spirit, Abram offered safety to many other Sodomites who had been taken captive by their common enemy. So while our record of Melchizedek and Abram's meeting is a picture of a godly gathering, the presence among them of other people, including Sodomites like Bera and Lot, make it also a depiction of saving grace on offer to sinners at that same fellowship event. For Lot especially, reconnection with Abram and then his contact with the king priest of Salem presented Lot with a God-given opportunity to consider his ways and repent of his evil decision to dwell in Sodom. We know, however, that although Lot's choice of Sodom was almost his downfall, he chose to go back there. And years later, at Genesis 18, Abram, or Abraham as he was by then, again had to seek to save Lot and his people from Sodom's final destruction by pleading with the Lord. The intercession Abraham made by appealing to God's mercy, even though it could not ensure Lot's salvation, because obviously salvation is a decision that each individual has to make for him or herself, nonetheless, that intercession by Abraham showed the same hope and compassion toward Lot that he showed in the fellowship event of Genesis 14. Well, Abram spent many years of his sojourn in Canaan at a district named Hebron. In fact, he was living at Hebron at the time that he made that intercession for Lot. With his wife, Sarah, and his concubine Hagar, and the son, Ishmael, and hundreds of male and female servants and their families, Abram's encampment will have been a sprawling, rather bustling place. There, with his large group of fellow tent dwellers, plus his local allies and their people, Abram surely shared many fellowship meals, and appropriately, Hebron means fellowship. After he and Sarai received the new names Abraham and Sarah, they had an especially spiritual and blessed fellowship meal when 3 angels came to the encampment at Genesis 18. Now, it's not really clear whether Abraham knew the true spiritual nature of his visitors straight away, but his immediate response to their arrival gives us an insight into his own spiritual character. In the divine presence, Abraham showed a humble, respectful, and fervent spirit of hospitality, which is a facet of spiritual character that God wants all his people to show, as we learn in Romans 12, 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, 1 Peter 4, and in Hebrews 13 verse 2, which says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in this way some have entertained angels without knowing it." Now, whether or not this refers to Abraham, he did serve as a ready host for his honoured guests, and he got busy to provide them a meal. So, as Genesis 18 verses 6 through 7 says, Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, prepare 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make bread cakes." Abraham also ran to the herd and took a tender and choice calf and gave it to the servant, and he hurried to prepare it. Taking upon himself the form of a servant, Abraham got water for his guests' feet and had them rest in the shade until he could bring them what he referred to earlier at verse 5 as a piece or morsel of bread. As we go on to learn, though, that piece or morsel was actually a goodly amount of bread. A little while later, at verse 8, we see that Abraham had served his visitors milk, yogurt, and barbecued beef, and was standing with them while they ate. Sarah was inside the tent by that time, and at verse 9 the angels ask after her. Well, in the famous exchange on record between them, when she overhears them say that she will bear a son, and then laughs to herself about it, and then denies that she laughed, and then gets caught out for denying it, in all this the final fruit of her labour goes unmentioned. But good works are never forgotten by God, not even Sarah's baking. And nearly 2 millennia later, Jesus would allude to it in one of his parables of the kingdom at Matthew chapter 3 verse 33 and at Luke chapter 13 verses 20 through 21. When Sarah prepared bread cakes for the angelic visitors, she will have used 3 measures of flour, 3 measures of flour as Abraham had stipulated. The baker woman in Jesus' parable used the same amount. So I believe Jesus is making allusion back to Sarah's baking. Each measure of flour is a seah, a dry volume estimated at more than 7 litres, and perhaps as many as 11 litres. This means Sarah had used at least 22 litres of flour, possibly as much as 33 litres. And this quantity is enough for, say, 30 to 45 loaves of modern shop-bought bread. If we imagine the task of merely buttering and filling the slices in this amount of bread, let alone actually mixing flour and water and kneading the dough and baking it all, we come to realize that Sarah had a lot of baking to do. She was not working alone. This was a group effort involving a large number of servants. We also work out that Sarah was not doing this only for Abraham's 3 visitors, even though his explicit instruction was prompted by their presence. Nevertheless, I have read some ancient Jewish commentaries on this that suggest that the three angels ate the whole lot. I have my doubts. Clearly, Abraham expected many others to join the meal, and more than that, we must infer that he wanted others to join it. Therefore, the meal that he and his immediate household shared in contributing to it should be visualized not as a tiny exclusive meeting, but as a full-blown picnic, as it were, for his whole camp. The fact a young bull was killed for the occasion also shows a large meal was intended. Well, that day, Hebron provided a model of spiritual fellowship the same way Salem had done. Here was a meal partaken of by a community who shared the Abrahamic faith. The head of the house provided the sacrifice, his bride provided bread at his behest, and God's messengers spoke his word to bring to remembrance the promised seed and to proclaim his coming.